You don't get to decide who belongs here. That's what justice is for. Leonard Briggs said, his voice low, steady, carved from years of silence. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't need to. Because sometimes, presence alone is resistance. This wasn't about a parking lot or a broken rule. It was about history, personal, painful, and unresolved. And here's the part no one saw coming. The officer who punched him wasn't afraid. He was calculated. He knew the man in front of him. Not as a stranger, but as the one who once ended his brother's career. That punch wasn't impulse. It was legacy. Passed down like a weapon, waiting for a face to land on. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Type it below. Let's begin. The late afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the concrete parking lot, washing everything in a soft amber glow that made even the rusted shopping carts seem oddly peaceful. Leonard Briggs sat behind the wheel of his silver SUV engine off-seat, slightly reclined fingers gently tapping the edge of his phone screen as he reread a message from his wife. Almost done, love, 10 more minutes. A small smile formed at the corner of his mouth, the kind that doesn't need witnesses, only memory, the kind shared between two people who have weathered decades and still choose each other every day. Outside, the muffled sounds of distant car doors, children's laughter, and grocery carts rolling across pavement blended into a quiet rhythm, a kind of suburban lullaby that made it easy for a man like Leonard, retired colonel, former military strategist, decorated veteran, to finally breathe. He glanced around the lot, instinctively mapping the space like he'd done on foreign soil more times than he could count. But here there was no threat, just a couple with toddlers loading groceries, a teenager blasting pop music from an old sedan, and a young man pacing while talking on the phone, his voice rising and falling like waves on a calm sea. Leonard wasn't just relaxed. He was rooted, grounded in a kind of peace that had been hard, won, and rarely offered. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to simply exist without armor. But peace, as he'd learned long ago, is often temporary, and sometimes it ends with the sound of tires crunching gravel a little too fast. The low growl of a police cruiser pulled him from his reverie, and he blinked at the sudden burst of red and blue lights bouncing off his rearview mirror. He sat upright, not in fear, but in trained awareness, like flipping a switch in his chest that had been installed decades ago. The cruiser pulled in fast, angled hard behind him, lights flashing even though no one else was around. Leonard didn't move. He placed his phone in the cup holder, rolled the window halfway down, and rested both hands visibly on the steering wheel, the way he'd taught young recruits in conflict de-escalation seminars back when cities were first rolling out body cams. Through the mirror, he saw the officer step out. White male, broad build, early 40s. No urgency in his movements, but something about the way he approached, chin-high, shoulders stiff, put Leonard immediately on alert. The man didn't walk like someone doing his job. He walked like someone already mad. Without a word of introduction, the officer, Crowley, the name patch, would later say, rapped his baton against the driver's side window with unnecessary force, the echo cracking through Leonard's calm like a gunshot. "Roll the window down," the officer barked, tone sharp enough to slice through bone. Leonard did as asked, slowly, deliberately meeting the man's eyes with the quiet steadiness of someone who had once briefed soldiers the morning before they marched into fire. "Good evening, officer," Leonard said, voice measured and even. "Is there a problem?" Crowley didn't answer the question. His gaze swept across Leonard's face over the lapel of his collared shirt down to the ID badge clipped to his glove compartment, Department of Defense, though the text wasn't yet visible. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked, his voice wrapped in suspicion, though the words were barely more than a whisper above a snarl. Leonard blinked once. "Waiting for my wife," he said calmly. "She's inside picking up groceries." "Step out of the vehicle," Crowley said flatly. There was no shift in tone, no escalation in his words, but the atmosphere changed like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Leonard stayed still for a moment, eyebrows raised just slightly, hands unmoving. "Excuse me," he said, not with defiance, but with the kind of quiet disbelief that comes when you're old enough to know you're being pushed. "We got reports of suspicious behavior in the area," Crowley said, hand now hovering near his hip. "I'm not gonna ask again. Step out." Leonard's chest tightened not from fear, but from something far older and heavier, the kind of weight that sits behind the ribs when history begins repeating itself in real time. "Officer," he began, voice still composed, "I don't know what you think is happening here, but I assure you I'm out," Crowley snapped, tapping his baton again, this time against the car door. People were starting to notice now. A woman pushing a cart stopped mid-step. A young man nearby had already pulled out his phone. Leonard exhaled, slowly unlocked the door and opened it with care. His every movement, deliberate palms facing out years of training, guiding his limbs like memory. He stepped out onto the pavement and Crowley was immediately in his space posture, wide jaw-clenched hands still dangerously close to his holster. "Turn around. Hands on the car," the officer said, his breath hot with something that wasn't duty. Leonard hesitated, not out of resistance but out of sheer disbelief. "Sir, with all due respect, I've done nothing wrong," he said. "I'm not carrying anything, I'm not armed, Crowley's hand shot forward, grabbing Leonard by the wrist, twisting his arm just enough to elicit pain but not quite injury. "I said, turn around," he growled. Leonard complied, pressing his palms against the roof of the car, feeling the heat still radiating from the metal. His shoulders were square but his jaw was tight now. The tension had fully arrived. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked, his voice strained but not cracking. "Whatever I need to find," Crowley muttered, leaning in close enough to whisper. "Guys like you think you're above the law." That sentence hung in the air longer than anything else that day, because it wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration, an exposure of bias buried just beneath the surface. Leonard's stomach turned not in fear but in anger, held on a leash. The same leash he'd had to hold his whole life. Around them, phones were recording. Voices began to rise, soft at first, then louder, then pointed. "What's he doing?" someone asked. "He didn't do anything," another said. Crowley barely registered them. If anything, the presence of witnesses only seemed to harden his stance. Leonard could feel the spiral beginning, that slow, unstoppable tilt into something irreversible. But then, over the chaos, a voice rang out clear and direct. "Leonard," it was Angela, her silhouette visible now as she approached from the store, shopping bags, swinging eyes locked onto the scene. Leonard turned, slightly relief and dread clashing behind his ribs. And just like that, the moment shifted again. Because now it wasn't just one man in a uniform against another in plain clothes. Now there was a crowd. Now there was context. And now there would be consequences. The moment the officer's fist connected with Leonard's jaw, a ripple went through the quiet afternoon like a stone dropped into still water, shocking not because of its violence, but because of its shamelessness in broad daylight in a public parking lot with phones recording and children watching. Leonard stumbled back just half a step, his hand instinctively rising to touch the edge of his mouth, where blood was beginning to bead warm and metallic on his fingers, not unfamiliar but deeply unwelcome. He didn't speak, not immediately. Instead, he looked up straight into the officer's eyes and held his gaze, not with defiance, but with a calm that had once steadied men under fire, the kind of calm that unnerved those who relied on power rather than presence. Behind him, a teenager gasped loud enough to break the silence that had frozen the bystanders into awkward stillness, and from the far corner of the lot someone shouted, "Hey, you can't do that!" It wasn't a scream, it wasn't outrage yet, but it was the first note of something shifting in the crowd, the beginning of a collective awakening. Another voice, closer this time, added, "He didn't do anything. He was just sitting there." And the tension that had been isolated between two men began to spread like a slow burn across dry leaves, fed by shock, filmed by phones, and carried by whispers of disbelief. Leonard stood straighter, ignoring the dull throb in his cheek and the growing ache in his back, where his muscles had tensed, instinctively holding in anger the way others might hold in tears. He turned his head just enough to scan the scene, half a dozen people now, maybe more, most with phones out, some still trying to make sense of what they were witnessing, others already broadcasting it to the world. A young girl, no more than 16, stood by the cart return station, phone in one hand and the other clenched at her side, her eyes wide with something that looked a lot like fear, but it wasn't fear for herself. The officer Crowley, still red-faced and breathing hard, shifted his stance, but didn't step back, didn't holster his baton, didn't say a word to the crowd gathering like storm clouds around him. Instead, he jabbed a finger at Leonard's chest and muttered, "Keep your hands where I can see them." Leonard didn't answer. His hands were already visible, slightly raised now, not out of fear, but to demonstrate the absurdity of the order. From behind him, a voice spoke with clear authority. "Sir, you need to de-escalate, right now." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning from someone who understood how quickly things could go from wrong to tragic. Crowley turned his head toward the speaker, and that's when Leonard noticed the man holding a phone in both hands, filming steadily, calmly, his expression firm, but not confrontational. The man was young, maybe early 30s, wearing a military veteran's cap and a worn green hoodie, and when Leonard's eyes met his, something passed between them, recognition not of faces, but of what it meant to have served and to now be seeing justice undermined by the very people meant to uphold it. "Do you know who this man is?" the veteran asked loudly, addressing the crowd, now holding his phone higher. "This is Colonel Leonard Briggs, Bronze Star recipient, 25 years of Service Joint Command experience. He's the reason half these officers have protocols to follow." A low murmur rolled through the crowd like the first clap of thunder before a summer storm. Someone else asked, "Did he say Colonel? Like Army?" Colonel and the word sparked something more visceral than curiosity. They sparked conscience. Crowley's expression shifted just for a moment, just enough to reveal the flicker of doubt before he masked it behind a fresh wave of hostility. Military or not, he spat, he's still a suspect, still refusing to comply. Leonard let out a slow breath, not quite a sigh, not quite resignation, but something measured like a man trying not to drown in absurdity. Suspect of what he asked quietly, so the officer had to lean in to hear. "Of sitting still, of being patient, of not defending myself after you hit me." A silence followed that question, not because people didn't hear it, but because they did. The crowd, now a dozen strong, had gone quiet in that electric way where people are holding their breath for what comes next. And what came next wasn't violence. It wasn't more yelling. It was a voice calm and steady from behind Leonard. He turned slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as he saw her, Angela, his wife, carrying 2 grocery bags, eyes scanning the scene like someone counting variables in a legal case which she once had. She stepped forward with purpose, setting her bags down without looking away from the officer. "Is someone going to explain why my husband is bleeding?" she asked, her voice neither loud nor angry but piercing in its clarity. "And why exactly is he surrounded by cell phones and batons while doing nothing but waiting in his car?" Crowley didn't answer. He adjusted his stance again, lips tightening as his hand moved once more toward his hip, not drawing but resting there like a reminder of the power he still believed he held. Angela noticed and took one step closer, unblinking. "I'd suggest you take your hand off that weapon, officer," she said quietly, "because you just put it on the wrong man." A flicker of uncertainty passed through Crowley's posture, not fear, not yet, but the realization that control was slipping away. The crowd was no longer passive. They were filming, narrating, live streaming. One woman held her phone with a trembling hand, whispering, "They hit him. They really hit him." A man beside her added, "They picked the wrong guy today. That's a colonel." Leonard looked at his wife, her jaw-clenched, eyes fierce, and felt a pulse of steadiness return, not because the threat had passed, but because he was no longer standing alone. He turned back toward Crowley, still bleeding, still bruised, but with his voice strong and clear. "You've made your choice, officer," he said. "Now the world gets to see it." And the world was watching, one phone, one witness, one truth at a time. The sound of approaching sirens sliced through the thickening tension like a scalpel, sharp and urgent, scattering birds from nearby lampposts and making heads turn in unison as a second patrol car veered into the parking lot. It skidded to a stop just a few yards from the growing crowd, tires crunching against the asphalt, lights pulsing like a heartbeat too fast for its own good. The driver's door opened first, and out stepped Sergeant Dana Wilcox, tall, lean, with a steady walk and cautious eyes, the kind of officer who knew that perception could be as dangerous as any weapon. A beat later, the passenger door slammed shut, and Lieutenant Mike Thorne emerged, broad, loud in his movements, his jaw already clenched before he even took in the scene in front of him. Crowley stepped back just slightly, as if the presence of fellow officers gave him permission to let his body relax, even though his hand still hovered near his belt. Leonard noticed it immediately, not because he was watching for it, but because after years of studying posture in combat zones, he'd learned how to read tension before it became violence. Angela didn't move, still standing between her husband and the officer who had assaulted him, her stance quiet but unmistakably resolute. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, not in chaos but in rising disbelief, the way people whisper in museums when they realize they're looking at something historic. "What's going on here?" Wilcox asked, voice-controlled, walking toward the group with her gaze moving quickly between Crowley, Leonard, and the bystanders now recording from nearly every angle. "Back up, Crowley," replied curtly, not looking at anyone in particular. Possible suspect refusing to comply. Situation got hostile. Thorne caught the last words and immediately squared his shoulders, scanning Leonard with a look that was more assessment than inquiry. "Is that right?" he asked flatly, nodding at Leonard as if daring him to answer. Leonard stood straighter, his voice steady but low. "I was sitting in my car, waiting for my wife. That's all." Wilcox paused. "That's it." Crowley didn't like the shift in tone, and he stepped in fast. He was uncooperative. Gave attitude. "I had to." "You had to what?" Angela cut in, her tone sharp but not raised. "Bleed him for sitting still." Her eyes locked on Wilcox, not pleading, not demanding, just laying the question out like evidence on a courtroom table. Thorne crossed his arms, clearly siding with Crowley before hearing anything more. "You don't know what it's like out here," he said gruffly. "You hesitate, you get hurt. We don't have time for explanations when someone's acting suspicious." Leonard turned his gaze on him. No malice, just calm certainty. "And what part of waiting in a vehicle makes me suspicious, Lieutenant? The skin, the silence, or the patience?" That question wasn't rhetorical. It carried weight, pressing against the edges of their silence like a door creaking open. Wilcox shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking toward the crowd. "There's a lot of people filming," she said, not quite to anyone but loud enough that Thorne heard it as a warning. "Yeah, I noticed," he muttered, lips tightening as he glanced at the phones pointed in their direction. "We're doing our jobs. Let them record." But the crowd wasn't just recording now, they were speaking. "I saw the whole thing," a man said, firmly stepping forward. "He was just sitting there." Officer Crowley lost it. "That man's a veteran," a woman added. "I recognized him. He was on the cover of that military leadership magazine last year." Their voices weren't loud, but they had the clarity of truth spoken plainly, and that alone made them impossible to ignore. Leonard remained still, but inside his thoughts were moving faster than he showed, calculating not what to do, but whether silence would still serve him, whether dignity could hold in the face of injustice this loud. He glanced sideways at Angela, who met his look with a simple nod, the kind of affirmation built from decades of shared resilience. "Captain Moreau needs to be called," she said, clearly directing her words to Wilcox. "This has gone beyond a field report." Crowley scoffed, a sound full of frustration. "You're making this political," he said, eyes narrowing. "You think rank makes you untouchable?" Leonard finally took a small step forward, just one, his hands still open and visible. "I think law should apply equally," he said. "And I think the moment you struck me, you made this personal." Wilcox raised a hand not to silence him, but to keep the space from boiling over. "Enough," she said, turning toward Crowley. "You have your report. But if you laid hands on him without cause, that's on you." Crowley's eyes flared. "You're taking their side. I'm taking the side of the truth," she replied, quietly but firmly. Thorne looked away, biting back something he wanted to say but knew better than to voice with cameras rolling. Angela, sensing the shift, stepped closer to Leonard and reached for his hand. "We're not going anywhere," she said calmly. "Not until someone takes this seriously." Leonard nodded, but inside something else had begun to stir. Not just anger, not even a desire for revenge, but a deep sense that this wasn't just a moment to endure, it was a moment to expose. He looked around at the faces watching, recording, whispering, and realized the decision had already been made, not by him but by the people who now bore witness. This wasn't just about a bad officer. This was about what happened when good ones stood by and did nothing. And Leonard had seen enough of that in every corner of the world to know one thing for sure: the worst damage is done in silence. And today there would be no silence. Angela Briggs didn't walk across that parking lot. She cut through it each step as deliberate as a verdict, each second ticking louder in her chest as she took in the chaos unraveling in front of her. She had seen her husband in uniform at military funerals, flanked by generals and saluted by nations, but never once had she seen him with blood at the corner of his mouth, standing restrained, while strangers held up their phones like shields. Her pulse quickened not from fear, but from a kind of cold, precise fury that only years in a courtroom and decades of being underestimated could produce. The plastic grocery bags in her hands hit the pavement with a soft thud unnoticed by anyone, because every eye had already shifted toward her the moment she spoke. "What the hell is going on here?" she asked, voice not raised, not frantic, just level, unwavering, and steeped in authority earned, not given. The officer nearest to her, Crowley, flinched slightly, at the sound not visibly, but in the way his hand moved instinctively toward his baton before he caught himself. Angela's eyes locked onto him like a spotlight, her voice calm, but with an edge sharp enough to slice through asphalt. "I asked you a question, officer," she said again, her heels clicking once more against the pavement as she closed the distance between herself and the officer who had put his hands on her husband. Leonard didn't move, but Angela could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly against his thigh, like a man holding back the kind of silence that could become something else if provoked too far. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Crowley said, trying to keep his tone firm, but Angela had heard enough condescension in her life to know when it came from a place of fear masquerading as control. "No," she said plainly, her gaze narrowing. "That's my husband, and I'm not going anywhere until someone explains why he's bleeding and why your hand was anywhere near his face." There was a pause, then not long, but long enough for the crowd to shift again, for more phones to lift a few inches higher, for murmurs to grow into coherent commentary. "That's his wife," someone whispered from the back. "She's a lawyer, or a judge or something." Another voice followed. "She sounds like she's about to own the whole department." Sergeant Wilcox stepped forward cautiously, her tone more measured than her colleagues, trying to find a place between damage control and professionalism. "Ma'am," she said, "we're trying to assess the situation. If you could just let us know," Angela interrupted gently but firmly, never looking away from Crowley. "You're not assessing anything until someone tells me who authorized force against a retired colonel doing nothing but sitting in his car." Crowley scoffed under his breath and muttered. He refused to comply. Military or not, it doesn't make him exempt. Angela's eyes darkened, not with rage, but with something colder and far more dangerous. The look of a woman who had built her life dismantling the logic of men like him, word by word, case by case. "Oh, I'm well aware that my husband doesn't get a free pass," she said, "but I also know what unlawful detainment looks like and what excessive force under color of authority becomes when a camera's running." Leonard exhaled slowly, watching her work not just as his wife, but as the woman who once argued against a federal judge in her 3rd year of law school and won. Her voice now wasn't just for him, it was for everyone watching, for every phone that would replay this moment, every set of eyes, too tired to be shocked but not too tired to care. And Angela wasn't done. Reaching into her bag with slow, deliberate motion, she pulled out her wallet, then a laminated card and a small black folder, nothing flashy, just official cold factual. She handed them toward Wilcox, who took them hesitantly. "That's his federal ID," Angela said. "Retired Colonel Leonard Briggs, clearance level 5, former advisor on police military de-escalation programs. You might recognize some of the tactics he helped write. That is, if anyone here's actually been trained on how not to punch a civilian in the face." Wilcox opened the folder and scanned the contents, her expression changing as realization set in, subtle at first, then unmistakable, like watching someone read their own name in a headline they weren't prepared for. "You trained officers?" she asked quietly, glancing up. Leonard finally spoke, his voice tired but composed. "Wrote the manuals, spent years trying to prevent this kind of thing from happening." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the weight of truth, landing too fast and too hard for anyone to soften the blow. Crowley looked away, jaw clenched, but Thorne stepped forward, still trying to regain control. None of this changes the fact that he was being uncooperative, he said. Angela turned her gaze toward him and smiled, not kindly but with the patience of a woman who's heard it all before. It changes everything, she replied, because now we all know exactly what you call uncooperative. The crowd murmured louder, now emboldened by context, by clarity, by the way truth feels when it lands with evidence. A teenager stepped forward from the back, raising his phone. "Yo, this guy's a war hero," he said, showing a quick search result with Leonard's name and photo. "Dude's got a medal named after him or something." Someone else followed. "That's the guy who testified in front of Congress. I remember him. They're really out here roughing him up in a parking lot." Angela turned back to Leonard, her hand finding his, briefly grounding him, as the world tilted in his favor again. His eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke, but everything that mattered passed between them in that quiet exchange. Not relief, not yet, but recognition that something had cracked, and once cracked, systems don't always close cleanly. Wilcox stepped back, holding the ID, her mouth set in a firm line. "We need to call this in," she said. "Now." Angela nodded once, calm and composed. "Good. And when you do, let them know that the narrative just changed. Because from this moment on, the world isn't going to see a suspect. They're going to see the man you tried to silence." And with that, silence truly fell, not of ignorance, but of reckoning, thick and undeniable. The kind that lingers long after the lights stop flashing. The moment Captain Elijah Moreau stepped onto the scene, something in the air shifted, not dramatically, not immediately noticeable to those unfamiliar with how power moves quietly, but like a subtle change in barometric pressure, the kind that tells you a storm has either just passed or is about to begin. He didn't raise his voice, didn't wave his hands, didn't ask for silence, he didn't have to. His presence alone slowed the pace of everything around him, like walking into a room and adjusting the light without touching the switch. Tall, broad-shouldered and dressed in a dark navy uniform that somehow looked more like a tailored responsibility than just fabric and stitching, Captain Moreau moved through the crowd like a man who'd been watching from a distance long before he ever approached. He didn't look first at Leonard or Angela or even Crowley. He looked at the bystanders, the people with their phones raised with anger in their brows and questions on their tongues, and then at the officers surrounding them as if silently reminding everyone in uniform that the uniform itself was not a shield against consequence. "Sergeant Wilcox," he said low and level, not a question, but an invitation for a clear, concise answer. Wilcox stepped forward, handing him the ID folder that Angela had produced just minutes earlier, her expression unreadable but her posture respectful. "Colonel Leonard Briggs," she said softly, "retired. No outstanding warrants, no cause for detainment that we can establish." Moreau opened the folder and studied its contents, with the kind of attention that made the rest of the parking lot blur into background noise. His thumb moved slowly across the laminated surface, pausing slightly at the federal seal, as though it carried more weight than it used to. Then he looked up first at Crowley, whose jaw was tight and defensive, then at Thorne, who shifted uncomfortably under the captain's gaze. "Which one of you initiated contact?" Moreau asked, his voice calm but too steady to ignore. "I did," Crowley answered, still trying to sound firm, but his tone betrayed him, too clipped, too quick. "And what was the cause for contact?" Moreau asked again, eyes narrowed slightly. "Suspicious behavior," Crowley replied, and even as the words left his mouth, they seemed to wither in the air. "Sitting in a car," Moreau repeated almost to himself, like he was testing the sound of the excuse before deciding whether it deserved to stand. "That's your suspicion." "Sitting in a car," Crowley stiffened. "It's a high theft area. I was responding proactively." Angela's voice cut in, not loud but sharp enough to slide between them. "He wasn't driving. He wasn't parked illegally. He was waiting for me while I bought groceries." Moreau turned to face her now, his expression softening for the briefest moment as recognition registered in his eyes. "Mrs. Briggs," he said with a small nod. "I've heard your name more times than I can count." "Then you know I don't speak lightly," she replied. "And I don't make accusations without fact." Leonard hadn't said much, but now he spoke not for himself but to steady the moment. "Captain," he said, his voice calm but full, "I don't want apologies. I want clarity. I want accountability." Moreau met his eyes and nodded once, a kind of slow, heavy gesture that said he understood far more than he could say out loud in front of cameras. "Remove the cuffs," he said, turning to Wilcox. Now, Wilcox didn't hesitate. She stepped behind Leonard's fingers, moving quickly but carefully, as though the cuffs themselves were radioactive and had already done more damage than anyone could admit. The sound of the metal releasing was small, but it echoed somehow a click that felt like a shift in the story being written in real time. Crowley stepped forward, voice rising slightly. "Sir, with all due respect, I followed procedure." He wasn't complying. He got argumentative. "And you struck him?" Moreau asked, interrupting with a tone, so even it felt like a trap. "No report, no request for backup, no de-escalation attempts, just a punch." The silence that followed said enough. Moreau's eyes didn't blink as he stared at Crowley. "You just assaulted a retired officer with clearance higher than anyone in this parking lot, including me. What exactly were you hoping to accomplish?" Crowley's mouth opened, but the words didn't follow. His hands hovered awkwardly at his sides, and for the first time the weight of his mistake seemed to register behind his eyes. Moreau turned back to the crowd and raised one hand, not to quiet them, but to signal something different, something rare. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for recording, for holding us accountable. We'll take it from here." The crowd didn't disperse, not yet, but they did pause, recalibrate, reassess what kind of leadership they were now witnessing. Angela stepped beside Leonard, brushing a hand across his wrist, as if checking for bruises, but also as a way of saying she was still here, still watching, still ready. Moreau lowered his voice and leaned slightly toward them. "I can't fix what just happened, but I can make damn sure it's not ignored." Leonard nodded. "That's a start," he said quietly, and though his face was composed, his eyes were tired in a way that only men who've served under fire and then come home to fight a different war can understand. As Moreau turned to speak into his radio, calling in the internal affairs liaison and initiating the first steps of formal investigation, the flashing lights of police cruisers continued to pulse against the warm concrete. But now they didn't feel like a threat. They felt like an opening. Like something might just be shifting, one decision, one witness, one captain at a time. By the time the internal call reached the mayor's office, the video had already begun, its slow climb across social media feeds, shared by witnesses, reposted by advocacy groups, and picked up by a handful of local journalists who knew a story when they saw one bleeding in broad daylight. It didn't take long for that video to make its way into the inbox of Senator Lorraine Givens, a longtime friend of Angela's and a former civil rights attorney who had campaigned on transparency reform and the very idea that justice should not depend on whether someone had a camera rolling. The footage didn't surprise her, but it did activate her in a way that only betrayal wrapped in protocol could. Within minutes, her staff had reached out to Angela, and by the time Leonard and his wife had left the parking lot, a call from the State House was already waiting. Angela took the call, quietly seated beside Leonard in the back seat of Captain Moreau's cruiser, their silence heavier than the hum of the engine or the flashing red lights that still reflected off the dashboard. "They're watching," she said softly after hanging up, her voice more tired than triumphant. "And not just the press. They're watching from the top." Leonard didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly. The kind of nod that comes when a man understands that his life is no longer just his own, but something symbolic, something being dissected and debated far beyond the space where it actually happened. Captain Moreau's eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror, not out of suspicion but out of a quiet awareness that things had shifted into territory few of them were trained to navigate. "We're putting Crowley on immediate suspension," he said, breaking the silence in the car. "There'll be a full investigation, body cam audit, internal affairs, review the whole playbook." Leonard looked up, voice calm but pointed. "Will the playbook include what happens when someone like Crowley gets hired in the first place?" Moreau exhaled through his nose. "It should," he said. "But that page tends to get stuck." Back at the precinct, the tension had already begun to mutate into containment mode. Statements drafted, media, liaisons, briefed legal departments, quietly reviewing their language for liability rather than truth. The union representative had arrived before the officers were even off shift, leaning against a vending machine with a coffee in one hand and a barely concealed smirk in the other. "We're prepared to defend Officer Crowley's actions," he told the front desk sergeant. "This smells like political heat to me, not misconduct." But his words didn't land with the certainty they used to. There were too many phones, too many witnesses, and too many conversations already happening outside the department's control. Inside a conference room on the third floor, Moreau sat down with two senior officers and a deputy from City Hall, all of whom looked like they'd just walked out of a fire they couldn't explain. "We need a response," said Deputy Councilman Owens, his tie slightly askew, his palms flat on the table, as if trying to press the problem into something manageable. "This isn't just another excessive force complaint. This one's got teeth and attention." Moreau didn't flinch. "Then stop talking like it's a media storm," he said. "Start treating it like a systemic failure, because that's what it is." Meanwhile, Angela was at home with Leonard pacing slowly across their living room floor as she took another call, this one from a legal contact with ties to national advocacy groups. "Yes," she said into the phone. "We're considering public legal action, but we want to be strategic." Leonard sat nearby, eyes closed, not asleep but silent. The kind of silence that isn't rest but restraint. He could hear the weight in Angela's voice, how every word she chose was being weighed not just for truth, but for impact, for timing, for how it might land when played back on a courtroom floor or news broadcast. "You sure you're ready for this?" Angela asked him after the call ended, her voice lower now, more intimate. Leonard opened his eyes slowly. "I wasn't ready for that punch," he said, almost with a smile. "But I took it. I'll take this too." Angela walked over, knelt beside him, her hand resting gently over his. "This isn't just about us," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why we can't walk away from it." Outside, the news trucks had started parking along the curb, long antennas, raised like antennae, sniffing for scandal. Neighbors peered out through curtains, some curious, some concerned, a few texting friends to say you won't believe what's happening across the street. But inside the Briggs home, the atmosphere wasn't one of drama, it was one of preparation. Angela pulled out a binder of documents from their home office, not for show but because she knew that words, dates, training certifications, and prior policy memos mattered when truth was put on trial. Later that evening, Captain Moreau sat alone in his office, the blinds half drawn, the hum of fluorescent lighting buzzing like a headache he couldn't shake. He scrolled through headlines, through early edits of news segments already framing the story in different directions. Retired veteran assaulted by police officer in apparent misunderstanding. Tensions rise as viral video spurs. Questions of bias and accountability. Briggs incident ignites new calls for police reform statewide. He leaned back, rubbed his temples, and whispered to no one in particular, "They're going to spin this every way they can." Then more firmly, "But not on my watch." Because he knew what most people watching would never see, the sideways glances from officers too afraid to speak, the paperwork buried beneath excuses, the recruits never trained to recognize the line until they crossed it. And for the first time in a long time, Moreau wasn't just trying to protect the department. He was trying to protect the public from the parts of the system that never make it into the reports but always show up in the stories people carry for the rest of their lives. The morning after the incident, Leonard Briggs sat alone at his dining room table, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside a folder that hadn't been opened in years. The early sunlight streamed in through the blinds, casting long, silent stripes across the wood grain, across his hands, across memories he'd once hoped would stay where they belonged, buried under duty, under discipline, under time. But after everything that happened, and after hearing Crowley's voice echo in his ears, "Guys like you think you're untouchable," Leonard knew he'd seen that kind of hate before, and not just in the abstract way. You sense it in a stranger's tone. No, this felt specific, personal, familiar in the way that makes your gut tighten before your brain catches up. He opened his laptop and typed slowly, deliberately, logging into a secure database only accessible through his old clearance. The screen loaded with a sterile gray-blue interface he hadn't seen since his advisory days at the Pentagon, back when he was reviewing threat assessments and interagency misconduct reports with the kind of objectivity he now understood was sometimes a luxury. In the search bar, he typed the name Brent Crowley. A pause. Nothing. Then a thought. He added a middle initial. Still nothing. He narrowed his eyes, leaned back in his chair, and let the quiet press in. Then he typed a different name, one he hadn't spoken aloud in nearly a decade. Stephen Crowley. The search results appeared immediately, And as Leonard clicked through the file, a knot he didn't know he'd been carrying began to harden deep in his chest. There he was, Stephen Crowley, former U.S. Army corporal dishonorably discharged in 2009 following a series of command violations during a classified NATO exercise overseas. Leonard remembered it now clear as glass. The arrogance, the insubordination. The moment Stephen ignored a direct evacuation order and put 3 soldiers' lives at risk so he could chase what turned out to be faulty intel. Leonard had filed the after-action report himself, not out of malice, but because it was the truth. A truth that had ended Stephen's military career before it ever really began. But that wasn't all. As he read on, Leonard saw the final note in the file: witness in misconduct proceedings, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Briggs. It had been sealed in protocol, but to the Crowley family there was no sealing the shame, and suddenly it all made sense. He sat there for a long while, eyes locked on the screen, the silence of the room filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock above the kitchen doorway. It wasn't rage that filled him, but something colder clarity. Crowley hadn't just reacted to Leonard as a stranger in a parking lot. He had targeted him, not just as a black man, not just as a symbol, but as the man he believed had destroyed his brother's life. Angela entered the room quietly, holding a folder in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked at him, read his face, and without asking she set both items down beside his coffee. "I got a name this morning," she said, keeping her voice low. "Crowley's older brother, Stephen. Court-martialed. Dishonorable." "And guess who was listed as a key witness?" Leonard didn't answer. He didn't have to. Angela saw it in his eyes. "So it was never about protocol," she whispered. "It was payback." Leonard nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "He's been holding on to it all this time," he said. "Probably watching me from the sidelines, waiting for a moment when no rank and no badge would protect me." Angela sat down across from him, brushing her fingers across the edge of the folder as if to steady herself. "You think this was planned?" Leonard looked at her, his voice quiet but certain. "If not planned, then prepared for. He knew exactly who I was. The moment he saw me, that punch wasn't fear. It was legacy." Angela leaned back, folding her arms. "Then we need to show them it ends with him." Leonard looked out the window for a moment, watching the wind shift through the leaves of the old oak in their yard, remembering missions where clarity came in gunfire and smoke, not the slow ache of being hunted in your own neighborhood. "No," he said. "It ends with the system that let him put on that badge in the first place." Later that day, Leonard and Angela met with Captain Moreau in his office. The room dim but quiet, lit only by a desk lamp, and the faint gray glow from a muted television broadcasting the latest round of public backlash. Moreau listened carefully as Leonard laid out what he'd found. His voice measured his words exact, his evidence clear. The captain didn't interrupt, not once. When Leonard finished, there was a pause, long and steady, like the silence between the end of a storm and the beginning of cleanup. "I had no idea," Moreau finally said. "Nothing in Crowley's file mentioned Stephen. Not even a hint of family military history." Angela leaned forward. "Because it was buried." But this wasn't just a failure of background checks. It was a failure of culture. He carried a grudge, and no one saw it because the system isn't built to look for it. Moreau exhaled and sat back in his chair. "We'll reopen his internal file. If there's a connection, we'll find it." Leonard's gaze didn't waver. "We already have. The question is, what do you do with it now?" That night, Leonard stood alone on the porch, a soft breeze rustling the hedges while the sky turned the color of steel. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt the weight of having named something that had lived too long in shadow. And in that stillness, he promised himself one thing, that this time he wouldn't walk away just because the damage had a name. This time he'd make sure it was seen. All of it. By the end of the week, the precinct was no longer just a building. It had become the center of something bigger than anyone wanted to admit, a place weighed down not by bricks and mortar, but by tension, distrust, and the quiet growing hum of reckoning. The usual sounds, phones ringing, officers chatting, keyboards clacking, were still there, but they came in bursts too loud or too short, like people trying to act normal while walking across a minefield. No one said it out loud, but the energy had changed. It was there, in the way officers avoided eye contact in the hallway, in the sudden silences, when Leonard Briggs's name came up, and in the weight of the cameras still parked across the street. Captain Moreau noticed it most in the briefings. Officers used to joke, tease, push each other's buttons, but now they just sat straighter and said less, waiting for orders, measuring their words as if afraid each syllable might be recorded and reviewed later, which truthfully it might. He stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, but what he really wanted to hold was control, and it kept slipping through his fingers a little more every day. "We're not the story," he reminded them in one briefing, his voice calm but strained, "but we'll become it if we don't hold ourselves to the standard we claim to represent." Some nodded, some didn't. In the locker room, the division was clearer. Younger officers whispered, asked quiet questions, pulled up videos on their phones, and exchanged glances as if trying to figure out where the line had moved. The older ones, especially those who'd known Crowley for years, either said nothing or defended him with a shrug and a tired, "You don't know the whole story." But everyone felt it, that slow, invisible fracture spreading under their feet, not loud enough to break anything yet, but deep enough to be dangerous. Leonard, meanwhile, found himself caught in a strange kind of stillness, suspended between being a victim, a witness, and an unwilling symbol. Every call he received came with a thank you, or a request, or both. Veterans groups, wanting statements, news networks, asking for interviews, advocacy organizations, offering to turn his story into something larger. But Leonard wasn't interested in becoming a headline or a hashtag. He wasn't angry at attention. He was just tired of how it always seemed to come after pain like justice, only paid visits after someone bled in public. At home, he found it hard to rest. The house felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way places do when they're filled with too many unspoken thoughts. Angela noticed, of course she always did. She watched him move slower, talk less, stare longer at things that used to mean nothing. The family photo near the mantel, the dusty stack of medals in the drawer. He never opened the front door where he'd pause just a little longer, each morning before stepping outside. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said one night, her hand on his as they sat on the back porch watching the yard darken with the fading sun. Leonard didn't answer right away. He just breathed slow and deep and finally said, "I know I don't. But that doesn't mean it's not heavy." Inside the precinct, Captain Moreau called an emergency meeting, not with the entire force, but with his senior staff, the ones he knew had influence beyond rank. The meeting wasn't long, but it was direct. "We're not circling wagons," he told them. "We're not burying this. If anyone thinks we're going to sweep a civil rights complaint under the rug in 2025, they can leave their badge at the door." One officer, a quiet veteran named Ruiz, nodded slowly and said, "That's the first time I've heard anyone say it out loud." Moreau just looked at him and replied, "Maybe that's been the problem." The following day, the department issued a public statement, not just acknowledging the incident, but outlining the steps. They were taking a full internal review, external oversight, and a listening session with community leaders. It was more than anyone expected, but to Leonard it still wasn't enough. Because he knew the difference between action and performance didn't change systems, it just bought them time. That same evening, Leonard and Angela met with a coalition of local leaders, faith groups, veterans, legal advocates, and a few former officers who had quietly supported reform for years but never had the right moment to speak. The meeting was held in a local community center with folding chairs and stale coffee, but it felt more powerful than any courtroom or press conference. Leonard stood up to speak, not with notes, not with talking points, just with the truth. "I'm not here because I want to be," he began, his voice clear but gentle. "I'm here because someone thought they could put a fist in my face and walk away clean. And that tells me we haven't just failed at justice, we've failed at remembering who we claim to be." The room went still, not because it was shocked, but because it understood. Angela looked at him, pride and worry sitting side by side in her expression. He continued, not for applause, but for accountability. "This isn't about one officer. This is about a culture that looks the other way until someone's camera catches what their conscience ignored. And I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here to ask, how long are we going to keep building systems that break people and then act surprised when they do?" No one clapped when he finished. They didn't need to. They stood. And for the first time since that parking lot, Leonard felt something shift, not in policy, not in headlines, but in people. And that, he thought quietly to himself, is where real change always begins. The morning the video reached 1 million views, Leonard Briggs stood at his bathroom sink, watching the water run over his hands as if it might rinse away something deeper than sweat or memory. Outside, the sun had barely broken through the clouds and the world still held the hush of early hours before phones started ringing and inboxes started filling with the latest headline. But Leonard already knew what today would bring, not because of a schedule, but because of a current in his chest, an alertness that hummed louder than the news itself. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a symbol, and symbols once ignited rarely quiet down. Angela came in quietly, a folder under one arm, her eyes scanning his face for signs he wouldn't show. "The city council just issued a statement," she said. "Half support the investigation. The other half are calling for a review of your past conduct." Leonard raised an eyebrow but said nothing, reaching for the towel, with a calm that belied the storm inside him. "It's starting," she added, voice low, almost apologetic. "They're digging, trying to find anything they can twist into a defense." Leonard met her gaze in the mirror and gave a slight nod, one that said, "I expected this," though his eyes held something heavier, disappointment maybe, or that deeper kind of tiredness that sets in when people try to turn your integrity into ammunition. "Let them dig," he said simply. "They'll find what I've always left behind: records, reports, and the truth." At the precinct, Crowley's name was no longer spoken aloud with certainty or respect. It had become a cautionary tale, a test of who still believed the old rules would protect them. The officer had hired a private attorney, one known for his aggressive media strategy, and released a statement that read, "Like a script, I feared for my safety." The situation escalated rapidly. "I regret the outcome but followed protocol." But Leonard knew the language. He'd helped write the original protocol, and nothing about what happened that day had followed it. That afternoon, Angela sat beside Leonard in their living room, scrolling through comments on a live stream from a local news station covering the upcoming disciplinary hearing. "You need to see this," she said, handing him her phone. The screen showed a clip of a young woman speaking at a community meeting, voice trembling but fierce. "When I saw that video, I saw my father," she said. "I saw every time he came home quiet, because someone treated him like he didn't belong in a place he'd fought to protect." Leonard Briggs didn't raise his voice, didn't raise his hand, he just stood there and took it. And still they say he was a threat. Leonard watched the clip twice, then handed the phone back in silence, his lips pressed together, as if holding in something too wide for words. Angela rested her hand over his fingers, warm and steady. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "But they're saying it for you now." The next morning they arrived at the hearing, not as victims, not as plaintiffs, but as witnesses. Witnesses to what happens when power forgets who it's meant to serve. The municipal building was surrounded by protesters, supporters, skeptics, and reporters, their voices a mixture of hope, anger, and exhaustion. Some carried signs with his name, others with simple questions scrawled in bold letters. What if he hadn't been a colonel? What if no one had filmed it? Inside the room was cold and overly lit, the kind of institutional brightness that tried too hard to feel neutral. Crowley sat at one end of the room, jaw clenched, his attorney whispering in his ear with the urgency of a man trying to keep a story straight under pressure. Leonard sat across from him, posture straight, hands folded in his lap, heart steady despite the weight pressing against his ribs. He didn't need to rehearse his testimony. The truth had been living in his bones since the moment it happened. When called to speak, Leonard stood slowly, each movement deliberate, like he was stepping onto a battlefield where no weapons were visible, but the war was real. His voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble, it just carried firm, level, and clear. "I did not resist," he began. "I complied. I spoke calmly, and I was struck." He let the words settle before continuing. "Not because of what I did, but because of who I was, or more specifically, who he believed I was not." Across the aisle, Crowley's jaw moved slightly as if preparing to speak, but he didn't. "Not yet. Not then." Leonard continued describing the moment, not with drama but with detail, the kind of clarity that made even silence feel like testimony. He spoke of service, of restraint, Of the moment his hands were up and his dignity was lowered in front of strangers with cameras and officers with excuses. And when he finished, the room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. The absence of denial was its own kind of victory. Later that evening, Angela and Leonard returned home to find letters in the mailbox, handwritten notes from strangers across the country. Some were veterans, some were mothers. Some were young people who had never heard of Leonard before but now carried his name like a reminder. He read a few, then set them down, each one leaving a small weight on the table between them. "They want you to keep going," Angela said gently. "They're looking for more than survival. They're looking for direction." Leonard looked at her, his face calm but resolute. "Then we give it to them," he replied. "Not just for me. For everyone who won't be believed until it's too late." And as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting the first shadows of evening across the quiet street outside, Leonard Briggs finally allowed himself to exhale, not because it was over, but because at last it had truly begun. The courtroom wasn't particularly large, but the air inside felt tight, like a space that had been holding its breath for far too long. Rows of wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of onlookers, community members, veterans, reporters, even a few off-duty officers who came not out of support but out of curiosity, hoping to see for themselves what accountability might finally look like. At the front, flanked by the seal of the city and a pair of subdued flags, sat the disciplinary panel, their expressions carved into cautious neutrality, faces unreadable but eyes alert. It wasn't a criminal trial, not yet, but everyone in that room knew the stakes reached far beyond administrative policy. Leonard Briggs sat quietly at the table designated for witnesses, his posture calm but firm, the same way he'd once sat before congressional committees and military tribunals alike. He didn't fidget. He didn't glance around the room. His hands were folded neatly in front of him, resting on a worn leather folder that held every statement he'd made since the day in that parking lot, though he didn't need to open it. The truth for him didn't live in documents. It lived in memory. Angela sat just behind him, her presence solid, her gaze unflinching. She wore a navy blazer and a simple silver pin. No slogans, no theater, just quiet power shaped by years of watching justice bend under pressure and sometimes snap. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't acknowledge the whispers. Her focus was entirely on Leonard and the weight he was about to carry once again. Across the room, Officer Brent Crowley sat beside his lawyer, stiff and tense in a department-issued suit that tried and failed to soften his image. His jaw remained tight, his expression unreadable, though every so often his eyes flicked toward Leonard, not with guilt or defiance, but something murkier, like a man trying to calculate whether regret would be more useful than denial. The chairwoman of the panel called the hearing to order with a polite but firm tap of the gavel, and after a brief introduction of the facts already well known to the public, she nodded toward Leonard. "Mr. Briggs, if you would." Leonard stood slowly, the scrape of his chair soft but echoing a small reminder that sometimes the quietest moments carry the most weight. He stepped forward, placed one hand lightly on the edge of the podium, and began not with outrage, not with drama, but with the kind of controlled clarity that made people lean in without realizing it. "I am not here because I want to be," he said. "I am here because I was forced to become something I never asked for, a symbol." He paused just long enough to let the words settle in the stillness. "On that day I was not breaking the law. I was not being aggressive. I was sitting in my car waiting for my wife." He recounted the events as they happened, fact by fact, tone by tone, without embellishment, without pause for pity. The officer's approach, the refusal to explain, the demand to exit the vehicle, the strike, the restraint, the silence afterward, the recording phones, the disbelief. He spoke with the steady cadence of someone reliving the moment, but refusing to let it define him every word, a step through a memory that had been weighed and examined 100 times before this one. "When I was hit," Leonard said quietly, "it wasn't the first time I'd felt the sting of injustice. But it was the first time I felt it so publicly, with strangers, watching, with the law itself silent around me." His voice didn't shake, but his eyes held something behind them, a depth of tiredness that no rank or medal could ever truly shield a man from. When the panel asked him to clarify how he responded during the incident, Leonard didn't hesitate. "I kept my hands visible. I followed instructions. I used my voice, not my fists." Then he added, "Which is more than I can say for the man who wore the badge that day." Crowley's attorney rose and offered a prepared statement, painting a picture of a tense situation, an officer acting on limited information, a man trying to control a scene without full knowledge of who he was dealing with. There was no malicious intent, the lawyer insisted. Just an officer under pressure, reacting based on the training he received. Angela leaned slightly forward in her seat, her brow furrowing as if to ask silently, and what exactly were they training him to do? Strike first, investigate later. Leonard didn't react to the excuses. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't respond. Instead, when given the opportunity for closing remarks, he returned to the podium and spoke directly to the room, not to the panel, not to the officer, but to everyone who might one day find themselves in his shoes. "This is bigger than one officer," he said. "This is about the decisions we make when we think no one's watching, and the ones we justify when everyone is." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown, the air filled with signs, chants, quiet conversations, and the low hum of reporters giving live updates. When Leonard stepped out with Angela beside him, the sound didn't swell into cheers or applause. It was something more respectful, more restrained. A wave of silence parted around him, not because people were unsure what to say, but because sometimes presence itself becomes a statement. Angela looked over and said softly, "You did exactly what you came to do." Leonard gave a small nod, his eyes scanning the horizon. Now we see what they do next. That evening, the panel's ruling was announced. Officer Crowley would be stripped of his badge, barred from public service, and referred for formal criminal investigation. The city issued a statement pledging deeper internal reform and new layers of oversight. But Leonard didn't celebrate. He simply sat on his porch with Angela, the sun slipping behind the trees, the world still turning in slow, deliberate silence. He sipped his coffee and said more to himself than to anyone else. Justice isn't loud, it's slow, it's quiet. But when it finally arrives, it holds. And Angela, watching the last light fade across his face, replied, "So do you." A week after the ruling, Leonard Briggs walked into a quiet government building just a few blocks from City Hall, the echo of his footsteps rising gently through a wide marble hallway that still smelled faintly of furniture polish and old paper. A receptionist nodded respectfully as he passed, not because she had been instructed to, but because she knew who he was and what he had come to represent. At the end of the corridor, a small brass plaque on a new office door read Senior Civilian Advisor, Community Policing and Integrity Oversight. The title was longer than Leonard liked, but the meaning behind it was clear. Change had begun, and this time he would have a seat at the table shaping it. Inside the office was modest: one desk, two chairs, a bookshelf half-stocked with reports, and a large window that overlooked the courthouse steps where he had once stood without a voice. Now people would come to him to discuss the training policy and human judgment that could stop what happened to him from happening again. But Leonard wasn't interested in policy as paperwork. He was here for something slower, deeper, the culture beneath the codes, the silent agreements, the unspoken rules that told some people they belonged and others they didn't. Angela visited the space that afternoon, walking through the door with a paper bag in one hand and a familiar expression of amusement in her eyes. "You've got exactly 3 things on that bookshelf and 0 pictures on the wall," she said, setting down lunch on his desk like she'd been doing it for decades, which in some ways she had. Leonard looked up with a tired smile. "The walls haven't earned decoration yet," he replied. "But the work's coming." She sat across from him, watching as he unwrapped a sandwich, her voice dropping to a gentler tone. "You know, they offered me a grant this morning," she said, surprising even herself with the words, "to set up a legal assistance fund for victims of law enforcement misconduct, starting with older adults who don't always have the platforms to fight back." Leonard raised his eyebrows. "You taking it?" he asked, already knowing the answer before she nodded. "Of course I am," she said. "It's time we built something lasting." And that was the truth. Neither of them had spoken out loud in those long days, since the hearing that victory, if it had come at all, wasn't in the punishment handed down to one man. It was in the doors now, opening for others, in the conversations that could no longer be avoided, in the quiet reshaping of a system too long untouched. Still, Leonard knew better than to celebrate too quickly. Because even as progress moved forward, there were undercurrents pushing back quiet grumblings in the precinct, thinly veiled resentment from officers who saw reform as threat, not opportunity. One morning, Captain Moreau invited Leonard to address a group of new recruits at the academy. The classroom was modern but sparse, filled with rows of fresh faces who looked young enough to have never known a world before. Cell phones recorded everything. Leonard stood in front of them, his voice steady as he began. "You'll wear a badge," he said, "but it's not armor. It's not authority by default. It's a promise. And if you don't understand what that promise costs, don't pin it to your chest." He didn't tell them about the punch, or the cuffs, or the humiliation. He told them about restraint, about dignity, about the power of listening before reacting. And when one recruit asked, "What if we're afraid?" Leonard paused, letting the room fall quiet before answering. "Fear's not a failure," he said softly. "What you do with it is." Back at home, the days found a quieter rhythm. Leonard spent mornings in his office responding to emails from cities requesting guidance and afternoons walking through neighborhoods he used to pass without notice, now nodding at familiar faces, stopping to talk with strangers who recognized him from news clips but spoke to him like an old neighbor. Angela's legal fund was already growing, bolstered by community donations and quiet endorsements from law schools across the state. She took calls at the kitchen table, drafting strategy with a pen between her fingers and her glasses halfway down her nose, always calm, always calculating. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the tree line, Leonard leaned back in his chair and said, "Do you think people really change?" Angela didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head and listened to the wind pass through the leaves like a breath catching between words. Then she said, "People, maybe. Systems only if we stay loud enough to make them." Leonard nodded slowly, eyes on the horizon where the last light clung to the sky like a promise not yet broken. "Then I guess we stay loud," he said, not with anger, not even with defiance, just with the quiet certainty of a man who knew what silence had already cost. And so they sat together in the soft hush of twilight, not as heroes or symbols or survivors, but simply as two people who had refused to look away. The porch light flicked on as dusk settled, casting a warm glow across their faces, not to announce anything grand, but to remind them that even small lights, when kept burning long enough, can change what people see in the dark. It was nearly dusk when Leonard Briggs walked the gravel path behind the community center, the air still warm from the fading sun, cicadas humming low in the background like a quiet chorus of memory. The grass had been recently cut, leaving that faint, earthy scent that always reminded him of childhood summers and late afternoon drills back in basic. In the distance, he could see folding chairs being arranged in neat rows beneath the outdoor pavilion where tonight's town hall would be held, not by officials, not by city leaders, but by neighbors, by mothers and teachers and veterans like himself who had grown tired of waiting for someone else to speak first. He paused beneath the edge of a tree hand, resting lightly on the rough bark, listening to the murmur of voices carried on the breeze. They weren't loud, but they were steady people, preparing questions, sharing stories, adjusting sound equipment with borrowed speakers and extension cords patched together from different homes. It wasn't polished, it wasn't scripted, but it was real. And that made all the difference. Angela stepped up beside him a moment later, holding a manila folder in one hand and a thermos in the other, her eyes scanning the gathering crowd. "Looks like we'll need more chairs," she said softly, almost to herself. Leonard smiled and nodded, taking the thermos from her hand and unscrewing the lid. "You brought the good coffee?" he asked, teasing gently. She smirked. "You think I'd send you up there without reinforcements?" They walked the last few yards together, not as a couple carrying the weight of what had been done to them, but as two people who had turned that weight into movement, into structure, into something others could now lean on. The small stage had no podium, just a microphone and a cracked wooden bench where previous speakers had sat. Leonard stepped up with ease, greeted by quiet applause that wasn't ceremonial, it was genuine. These people hadn't come for performance. They had come for conversation. He spoke plainly without notes, his voice low, and measured the kind of tone you'd expect from someone who had learned to value silence just as much as speech. "This started because someone thought I was out of place," he began, "and it nearly ended with people trying to tell me to sit down and be quiet." He looked out across the audience, faces lit by string lights hung above their heads, eyes attentive, not because he demanded it, but because his words reminded them of something they already knew. He didn't talk about justice like it was a finish line. He didn't use big language or legal terms. He spoke about dignity, about what it meant to be seen as human, about how tired he was of apologies made only after videos went viral, and how real change never came with hashtags. It came when people kept showing up after the cameras left. Angela watched him from the side, arms crossed loosely, expression soft but sharp the way it always was when she knew he was walking a line between vulnerability and resolve. He didn't like attention, and yet here he was holding a microphone in a backyard pavilion with 200 people nodding quietly in agreement. When he finished, there was a pause, not for effect, but because sometimes the truth takes a second to settle. After the forum, people came up one by one, some just to say thank you, others to ask how they could help. A young woman pressed a letter into Angela's hand, handwritten and folded neatly, explaining how her grandfather had once been mistaken for a trespasser in his own driveway, how no one believed him until it was too late. A high school senior asked Leonard if he'd speak at her civics class, said they were learning about constitutional rights, and it hits different when you hear it from someone who lived through it. He promised he would. He meant it. Later that night, back on their porch, Leonard sat with the letter in his lap and his feet propped up on the railing, the breeze cooler now brushing past his shoulders like an old friend. Angela handed him a blanket, then settled into the chair beside him, her body angled just enough to catch the last light of the day. "You realize this isn't over," she said, not as a warning but as a reminder. He didn't flinch. "I'm counting on it," he replied. "Things worth fixing never are." The porch light flickered on, casting a warm glow across the wood, and making the shadows stretch longer, thinner, quieter. Somewhere in the neighborhood a dog barked once, and then everything fell still again, like the world had paused just long enough to let them breathe. And in that stillness, with a folded letter in one hand, and the memory of too many hard days behind him, Leonard didn't feel like a victim or even a victor. He felt like a witness. Not to what had been done, but to what was still possible. The kind of witness who doesn't look away, who doesn't forget, and who understands that healing isn't a moment, it's a direction. One, you walk toward one conversation, one choice, one ordinary evening at a time. What happened to Leonard Briggs isn't just a story about one man, one officer, or one moment caught on camera. It's a reflection of a much deeper truth about how systems forget the people they were meant to serve. It reminds us that respect isn't something worn on a uniform, and justice isn't something handed down. It's something earned, something protected, and sometimes something fought for quietly and steadily over a lifetime. For older generations who've lived through change, who've seen rights won, lost, and fought for, again, this story is a call to remember that your voice still matters. Your wisdom, your presence, your lived experience, they carry power. Leonard chose not to fight back with anger, but with truth, with patience, and with purpose. His story shows us that even in a world quick to forget, dignity leaves a lasting imprint. And maybe the greatest lesson is this: the quiet courage to stand firm, especially when no one expects you to shift the ground beneath an entire system. If this story moved you, if it made you think or reminded you of someone you love, don't let it stop here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that matter, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply not look away. Thanks for watching. Stay strong. Stay present, and above all, stay human.